Hello, friends, and welcome to this podcast. I'm going to talk about music. There's a lot of music I talk about comes from the decade of the 1980s. That was when a lot of really interesting stuff was happening. Um, a lot of musicians were reacting, I guess, to the 70s. And in a way still reacting to the music of the 60s, but the music of the 70s kind of got overblown in a way that a lot of younger musicians started becoming a little bit tired of, in a way, or a little bit maybe resentful of, when they were seeing these bands that were going on tours that had these $10 million stage presentations and zillions of lasers and lights, and all the band members were dressed up in flashy costumes, and it started to not be that kind of street informed rock and roll that so many people were craving. There was a lot of struggles going on at the time with people. There were people in England and America and elsewhere that were dealing with issues with poverty and their horrible politics and their leaders and all that. It was a time where a lot of people were really frustrated, and there was a lot of poverty going around, a lot of depression and feelings of hopelessness. And then here's these bands all dressed up in flashy feather boas and glitter, and with a giant light show and all this kind of stuff, playing these overblown anthems about rock and roll, and partying all night, and rock and roll all day and whatever. And they just weren't buying it anymore. So there were a lot of bands that created, that kind of developed this sort of do-it-yourself attitude about music. They started going to pawn shops and getting guitars and going into the garage and saying, you know what, we don't need a $7,000 1959 Les Paul. We don't need the huge amounts of production and all these other things that go along with the big dinosaur bands. We can do something cool with a pawn shop guitar that I got for $25, and this cheap old amp that somebody's brother gave us, and this microphone that somebody got. You put the things together that you can afford, and you do it anyway. You don't stop because you can't afford to get the best stuff. You just get what you can and you do it anyway. That was kind of the attitude of the early punk rock days, the punk rock, the post-punk, and the kind of new wave era. And in some ways, there were some bands that were doing that, but in an electronic way. They were using cheap synthesizers, and they were getting pawn shop keyboards, and they were sort of cutting the expense of having a real drummer by having a little drum machine that they could program with all the drum parts to all their songs, and click sequence one, and then they would start playing their keyboards or their bass guitar or whatever. And so it was really kind of like an era of music where people were, average people, if you had something to say, you could do it. You didn't have to be a millionaire, which was really cool. That was the spirit of those days. Some of those bands, however, some of those electronic kind of pop bands, they did kind of go into there was a popularity. Of course, those bands, the record labels were seeing how many kids were showing up at the shows, and they're like, okay, we have to get some money out of them. Let's sign them to our record and pay them as little as possible and put their records out. So they were giving them studio time and all that kind of stuff. And there were some bands that were mostly electronic synthesizer type pop bands that did get the studio time. They went in and they got a really good producer, and the studio's record labels decided to invest some money in them. And one of those bands that I think is just great, you can tell they started out with just pawn shop stuff, just because of I don't know why I can tell that. Maybe I read something, article or something, but they went into the studio and had access to a lot more production, and it really enhanced their songs, and those songs became kind of anthemic around the time, and iconic. And I'm talking about Tears for Fears. I know you've heard of them because their songs have been covered by a lot of other people. Um, they're I can't remember who now, but they've been in some of their songs have been in movies. Um, like Mad World. That's it. Yeah, Mad World is on here. The Hurting, Pale Shelter, um, Start of the Breakdown, Suffer the Children. This is a kind of a dark album in some ways, kind of like Joy Division in a way, but a little bit more uplifting and a little bit more hopeful in some ways. Joy Division seemed to be a sort of a cry of sadness, similar to this one, but there seemed to be no way out with Joy Division. But with Tears for Fears, I mean, even the name is very sad. Some people say it's kind of a pretentious name, and at the time when it came out, I remember thinking it's sort of pretentious name, Tears for Fears. Um, but it kind of grows on you, and now it's just the name of their band. You don't even think about it anymore. And all the songs on here were these sort of sad, these kind of melancholy cries for help sort of songs. There's a thread of interesting psychology that runs through this about how children are, if a child is hurt early in life, they tend to bring that hurt to other people, things like that. And in that way, it's kind of a heavy album. It's not like an uplift, it's not like a dance pop album like Depeche Mode may have been, or Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, which were all kind of dark. They all had their darkness. And that darkness was a sort of that was the element that they had, that the guitar-based punk rock bands had anger. The guitar-based punk rock bands were expressing anger, and I think the electronic bands were sort of expressing a kind of existential depression, like more introverted, rather than smash it up. They were saying it's sad. Things are very sad. That's what this album is. It's kind of it's an expression of sadness, but the thing is, it's beautiful. The music on here is great. The songwriting is incredible. The singing, of course, is great. The two of these guys were worked together so well, as like the keyboards and then the bass player and the voices were so nice together. And there's some really incredible rhythmic synthesizer programming on here. The beats, the programming, the sequences, all the stuff on here is really tight, really beautifully produced. There's that sort of marimba sound that you remember from their songs, and there's a lot of that, a lot of really nicely programmed synthesizer sequences and sounds on this album. But on top of everything, it's just great songwriting. It's really beautiful, kind of melancholy. The album is called The Hurting, so you get what you pay for with this one, but it's definitely worth it. Loved this album, loved it when it came out, and I still listen to it. It's a good one. And they did such great stuff later too. Everybody wants to rule the world and whatnot, and they're still out there. I think they're doing a tour right now. But check out that first album. It's really interesting. I like it. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again real soon.